So hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be discussing what lawyers can learn from software developers. My name is Roisin Noonan. I'm the COO here at the Law Boutique and co-founder of the One NDA initiative, and I'm going to be moderating this morning's session with our amazing panelists. But before I hand over to you guys, I'm going to introduce the topic a little bit. So a few years ago, with the inception of smart contracts and all this technology that was coming out that was said to revolutionize the legal industry, there was a lot of conversation about whether or not lawyers should actually learn how to code. And thankfully, as Tom, you said, the conversation has thankfully moved on from there. The consensus being that if you want to be a developer, then you should go and be a developer. Lawyers shouldn't necessarily try and do it on the side. I mean, it's good to gain some learnings from that, but it's not where lawyers should necessarily be. But aside from just the language that software developers use, there's so much more that we can learn from them. And this conversation is more relevant than ever, the conversation that we're going to be having today, because with the rise of legal operations, the trend towards standardization within the legal industry, and the proliferation of legal tech that we're seeing at the moment, this is the time to really be learning from an industry that's just light years ahead of us when it comes to technology and innovation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our panelists for intros. Tom, do you want to go first?
Hi everyone, I'm Tom. I'm a structured finance lawyer at Linklaters. So my sort of main day job is securitization finance, which involves generally a lot of documents with a lot of pages and a lot of stakeholders. And frankly, a big part of my job is deal management as much as legal advice. So I'm really interested in what we can learn from other disciplines to do that more efficiently. I think we probably have more cross-references in our documents than Elektra would allow if she was in charge. So I'm looking forward to talking through sort of different approaches to that. But yeah, I think as you say, Roisin, there's a lot that we have to learn. We had a really interesting session with our team with some of the software developers at Linklaters, just to sort of bring them in and talk about how they work, and that was a fascinating discussion. So I'm really excited to explore these topics today.
Cool. Patrick?
Sure. Yeah. Hey, my name's Patrick van den Hoevel. My last name sounds Dutch, but I'm not. I'm based out of Munich, Germany, and I worked for Google now for 2 years. Before that, I've been heading legal departments in other companies and doing a very classical lawyer's job. Now I'm doing something a bit different, more commercially focused probably, or more commercially engaged. What we're doing here as a team in Deal Pursuit, that's what the name of our team is. We are translating customer needs and demands into something that Google is able to deliver from a technical or finance or whatever other commercial perspective. So we have various clients, internal customers, sales, external customers, the customer itself. We also have our other stakeholders where we are the front end. So for example, the legal department is our expert, whereas we are the front end to the customer. And we are also trying to, let's say, translate what the legal team is telling us to something meaningful that the counterpart that we talk to sometimes, which is not necessarily the legal person on the other side, is understanding and buying into, so that we can actually move ahead and accelerate the contract closure much faster. This is the main purpose of our team. We do a lot of admin stuff as well. We do track changes in a way that software engineers do track bugs. I've told you that already, Roisin. And so we've been learning, or we constantly learn from what our amazing software developers do, because we work quite closely with them. And the more we are engaged on deals, and the more we actually interact on the real level that the real benefit is for the customer that we provide, the more we actually realize that we should have had those conversations more often, because there's so much to learn from different departments, not necessarily only software developers, but also across the whole business landscape. So I'm very curious to hear, especially from Will, our expert on the software development side, what he's going to tell us about.
Definitely. So Will, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Will Simmonds. For my sins, I've been in software engineering for over 2 decades now, which is somewhat scary thinking about it. I've had a varied career through starting up my own businesses. Spent about half of my time in the financial space so far. My last decade prior to joining Curve was as an independent contractor and consultant, working at various different organizations in different sectors, which gave really fantastic insight into how software engineering functions across organizations, varying from I won't say boring, but I'll say utility companies through to high profile e-commerce companies today, and even spending nearly a year with Mercedes Formula One team and working in their design office and seeing how they build software. So I'm currently the principal engineer at Curve, or one of several principal engineers, which is an interesting role, very, very varied and very demanding role, which focuses across multiple teams and is really about how we continue to build and innovate with the software that we're building. So it's not only hands-on engineering, but it's looking at the processes, it's looking at how can we keep on improving. And I think one of the fundamental aspects of being a good software engineer, and we've got a saying when we hire people, we look for lazy people. We want to find people who don't want to do the same thing twice. They want to actually automate it and solve problems. And Patrick, what you were saying in terms of focusing on customers, really a lot of, I think, what we're going to talk about today in terms of open source and approaches that we take are about enabling engineers to really be focused on solving problems and not repeating the same things over and over again. So very much looking forward to it.
Thanks, Will. Elektra?
Hi everyone, I'm Elektra. I'm the founder and CEO of the Law Boutique, and I'm also the co-founder of the One NDA initiative. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the way that we work as lawyers and how different it is to the rest of the world, particularly software developers. And I've talked a lot about this in other webinars and things that we've written. And I'm really keen to hear some more views on this, because I don't think it's been explored enough. So hopefully this will be one of the starts to that conversation more broadly.
Excellent. All right. Well, I wanted to kick off, before we get into how software developers work and what we can actually learn, I wanted to kick off by asking why we're having this conversation in the first place. Is this because lawyers just want to get in on the act and look a bit cool, or is there something a bit more existential going on here? Tom?
Oh, I definitely want to look cool. That's a big part of it for me. No, I think you're right. I mean, that there are some key trends as you identified at the outset in terms of as a large law firm, how we respond to challenges in the market. Lots of different types of players coming in and playing different roles, and we have to be responsive to that in order to maintain our market position, frankly. And so part of that is sort of making sure that we're working in the most efficient way that we can. And I think it would be insane if we had a group of people in the firm who have ideas about different ways of working and we don't tap into that, which is why I think it's important that we have these conversations. So I think it's a bit about that, but it's also those sort of trends that you mentioned of around legal tech. We're seeing the technology itself as well as the different ways of structuring a business really challenging the way that we do things. And the people who've been working with technology and really understanding that speed of change and how quickly you need to adapt to stay up to date with technology are the people who are developing it. So again, it really makes sense to tap into that knowledge in order to make sure that we're adapting and delivering for clients in the most efficient way we can.
Definitely, yeah. Elektra, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think that there are various reasons why we need to start thinking about the way that we work. So firstly, the clients don't really want to pay for lawyers to do things that are so version control and looking for the right version of a document isn't something that the client will pay for. And I'm not saying that law firms will always charge for that, but if you are spending a long time trawling through different versions or receiving red lines and comparing them to the other document that you had and then doing a PDF and also sending the Word version, this is absurd. This is an absurd way of working when there are things like GitHub, where Will could talk more about that, where you can do a pull request and then you can all work on your own version. There's really basic technology out there that's used by the wider industry that we could adopt as lawyers. But I was having a conversation with someone yesterday and they said that most lawyers that they know don't know how to do an Excel spreadsheet or use a formula on an Excel spreadsheet. So I think there's a disparity between our technical abilities as lawyers because and the available technology that's out there, and the PDF with the red line, even though it's definitely not the most reliable version control method.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm super interested in hearing about the parallels between GitHub as an example and the way we do version control. And Will, you know about that?
Yeah, so source control is extremely important to maintaining a history of everything that's changed, especially in a regulated industry such as Curve. We have to maintain a history of everything. We have to have the audit trails. We have to have the proof that things have actually been approved. But collaborative working, perhaps software engineering is a little bit less combative than the legal world. So oftentimes it's not only around using things like GitHub or GitLab or other source control systems, but it's also around how we work together. There are elements such as pair programming. It's very popular these days, where instead of just one person individually working on a challenge, you actually get two engineers. And this isn't the case of having a senior engineer and a junior engineer. You may have two equally senior engineers because you can solve the problems more quickly and iteratively through that process. So things like GitLab give us the ability to, GitHub, we use something called GitLab internally, which is a competitor to it, give us an ability to make sure that our workflow is really built so that multiple eyes are going over every change and we can quickly review them. So we don't have to compare them manually in PDFs. That sounds like an absolutely horrible process. It's all automated and will highlight what has actually changed for us. That I think is very effective and beats the old way of, or some of the old ways in my earlier career that were rather painful.
And on top of that, Will, I was going to ask you at first, the software developer world can't really operate as successful as it does without the community and collaboration that we've already talked about. So for example, going on Stack Overflow and asking a question, who knows how to do this? And then people providing answers and people looking at open source code on GitHub and contributing to it and making it better, which generates efficiency for everyone else. They can just pull down on that code and merge it into whatever they're working on. How would you be able to do your job without that level of collaboration community more broadly?
I'm not sure if I should answer this question, but if any developer said they haven't used Stack Overflow, I think they would be lying. That community and that fostering and wanting to share knowledge is really important, especially things are moving very quickly. We're working on new technologies that not many people may have used before and they may be poorly documented. The fact that there are so many people out there who actually want to answer questions and contribute back is phenomenally useful. I'm sure you will find code from Stack Overflow in the majority of businesses across the world who build software.
So just for the people that might not be familiar with these tools, can you give us a brief explanation of what GitHub or GitLab or any Git technology is and what it does?
To be technical, Git is a distributed version control system that enable, how best to explain it without using terms. Obviously, all computer programs are made up of the code, which then gets compiled into the computer program. It's at a higher level, so it's understandable to us normal engineers. There are some incredibly talented engineers who can understand machine code. Unfortunately, I'm not at that level. But the most effective benefit that it gives us is the ability for us to work in parallel, for example, on the same system. We could be working on different sections of an application or a suite of services, but be working in isolation on our own particular versions and then bringing them back together again effectively, I would say. It also means that if ever we make a mistake, and I will admit to it, I probably do make a fair few mistakes myself when I'm doing things, we've always got the ability to go back in time and see what's actually changed and revert back to it. So it's not like a change that you've made in a document and you lose, although I'm aware that online collaboration, online Word and Google Docs do keep some history now. We've always got that ability to revert back. So you can be more fearless in terms of getting rid of things. You may have built something last week and then just decide to completely get rid of it, knowing you can always go back in time and pull it back again. So I think in terms of then GitHub and GitLab, they are online hosted services that add a whole lot of social collaboration around there. So you've got features for actually reviewing changes so that an engineer can submit and effectively propose their changes to an application through what's known as a pull request or a merge request. And then other engineers can easily review and comment on it in a short period of time and get those changes included. And then there are other social elements built on as well that are expanding at the moment.
Interesting. Thanks, Will. I wanted to delve a little bit more into open sourcing and how much that is relied on in the software world, and how we think that could potentially translate into the legal world. Patrick?
Open source in the legal world. So I think there are limitations to that, because every customer or every company wants to retain their knowledge and the reasoning behind certain ways of how they do things, and they sometimes tend to hide things in contracts intentionally because they think they're going to benefit from those in the long term. But I believe that this crowdsourcing aspect is super important in actually getting better contracts, getting better agreements, and learning from things that have been working, and also predict the future a bit more, right? But what we do as lawyers is that we're trying to anticipate risks and avoid them by adding some language in the agreement that prevents, that mitigates that risk or makes it transparent so that the parties may be finding a commercial solution to it. But we also need to make sure that, from my perspective, that whatever we draft is going to live longer than the contract's intention or the contract duration is. So, so what we don't always consider is the growth and the changes of both parties and the changes that are being made to the agreement over time as well. So we sometimes take a status quo look at the contract, try to anticipate the risks, but not anticipate the changes that might be happening to the agreement, to the delivery of the services. And that's going to cause issues in the long run, because customers and also the service providers might change the way they are providing the service, or the customer might change the way they're actually consuming the services, which would require a change to the agreement. So these are all things that could be solved by thinking more openly about what may happen from a delivery perspective or contract agreement perspective, by using a much broader audience and develop some sort of, at a common denominator of agreements that would serve as the basis and foundation for, let's say, more individualized contract negotiations. And they might be serving as a better, let's say, basis of trust, because it's been vetted with other stakeholders. So this is more or less a better version of a contract without having this lobbying piece happening sometimes when parties want to develop the, let's say, the best agreement, the new template that everybody's going to use, because they're ignoring the people that would actually use these contracts. They should have engaged them in the first place. So inclusivity is not only something that applies to companies' cultures, but also applies to how you actually develop terms, agreements, and anything like this in the lawyers' world as well.
Definitely, and that goes to the whole, open sourcing leading to standardization, and that's something that the business, that software developers have been extremely successful at, is developing common standards so that everything is interoperable where legal isn't. So everyone's working off their different versions. If you open source some elements of that for everyone to essentially crowdsource it, get to an agreed standard, and then you're actually only negotiating the things that really matter or are really discreet to your organization. Elektra, I imagine you'd like to go in on that.
Well, yeah, Patrick, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That there is the fact that we don't work in a collaborative way to create our own terms and conditions, and we work in silo. So if you're ABC Limited, you sit down and you go, right, what terms do I want in my agreement? So you sit down, you write your terms, or you get a law firm to write your terms for you. Then you take those terms and you flow them out to your suppliers, and the supplier has a lawyer that will pick up the agreement and will have to read through the whole thing, even the severability clause, even the entire agreement clause, even the notices clause. These are clauses that exist in every single agreement, and yet we have no standards for them. So the lawyer has to pick that agreement up and read it word by word, or skim it and pretend that they've read it word for word, because they're afraid that the other side has snuck something in. So what this actually does, it creates a lack of interoperability. So you can't plug it into the other side because there are no standards. And this is problematic, and it creates inefficiencies. So we talked about version control, which is an operational problem, and the fact that we don't use the right technology or process around it. But this is even more fundamental because there is a lack of standardization, a lack of interoperability, and that stems from this lack of collaboration in the legal industry. We don't ever have the opportunity, except for the One NDA initiative in my experience, where we all sit down in a non-adversarial environment and go, right, what makes sense? What's sensible? And what we found with the One NDA initiative is that actually, if you put 59 lawyers in a room and get them to try and agree to something, if they're not in an adversarial environment, they agree much more than they disagree. And that's really interesting. That's a really interesting social and professional experiment, because what if we did that more often? What if we sat down and said, right, okay, we've done the NDA, now let's talk about all these other boilerplate provisions that exist in every single agreement that bore the hell out of me, actually. I don't never want to read another boilerplate provision in my life again. I just want to know what it says and then be done with it. Can we imagine a world like that, Tom?
I was going to say, Tom, you've had lots of experience with ISDAs, so
yeah, I think so. I mean, so there are some good examples, right? And the One NDA initiative is the most current and I think the most innovative. And so I think that's really exciting. But yeah, ISDA, for people who don't know, ISDA is the swaps industry association. They've produced a whole range of standard documentation, which is used very broadly in the industry. And is structured, it's been around for some time, but it's actually structured in quite a forward-thinking way and in quite a modular way, which is a topic that I think we can come on to as well, that bears some similarities to software development. So I think there are some good examples that probably do two things. One is demonstrate it's possible, but also by the fact that there aren't that many of them, demonstrate that there's room to do more. I think there are challenges as well, though. I mean, if you compare the open source movement to legal, as I understand it, in software, and this is a topic obviously I'm going to pick up as a lawyer, but there is a tendency to try and exclude liability for any consequences of the software being wrong, whereas clearly with any legal document, our clients expect us to be on the hook, and they, effectively part of what we bring to a transaction is providing assurance that the agreement is right. How do you get that? I mean, in software, you do that through testing, and you run very specific, measurable, verifiable tests to make sure that the software is delivering the desired result. I think that's a lot more challenging when you get into the complex end of legal contracting, to kind of get everybody comfortable that the clause that they pick up from a GitHub library or equivalent actually works and delivers what they want. And people like ISDA have solved that by having a market legal opinion on the document that's prepared by a law firm, that then everyone can look at. And I guess that's the legal equivalent of testing, is a legal opinion. But we haven't thought through in many cases those ways that support collaboration.
Yeah,
great point. I was going to say that I guess it depends on what your risk tolerance is, because if you're going to a firm like Linklaters, then yes, obviously they're expecting it to be top notch and spot on. But if you're just need an agreement that a lot of people have said is correct, doesn't necessarily mean it is correct. But if you need something operationally and it's the likelihood of it going to court is so small, then I get. But it's a good point. I don't know what the equivalent would be of testing.
Yeah, well, you can't really test it, and I think we just need to get comfortable with that. Even if you do pay Linklaters to give you a legal opinion, it doesn't mean that it's completely watertight. It just means that you've got an insurance policy. to be honest. So if you were to take that approach more broadly, if you just had a library of boilerplate clauses that meant that you could just refer to, 90% of your agreement being part of this GitHub library, then Linklaters or another law firm could just say, yep, that's fit for purpose for this occasion. You're not, when you're delivering a piece of work, a contract, you're not guaranteeing that every single word is fit for purpose. You're just guaranteeing that the concepts within that do what the client wants. So if you were to use language that was boilerplate to do that, and you still were able to confirm that that was fit for purpose, then it's not really that different. The only difference is that you're cutting down time, and when you're sending it to the other side, they don't have to read it word for word, because your severability template clause will be very different to that of another law firm. They say the same thing though.
Yeah,
so,
no, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think you're saying a good thing here. It's about also, how do you measure quality of a contract, right? So that's an issue that I, for example, with my team are facing, because how do we measure that we've actually done a good job on coming to an agreement with the customer? So I guess we try to avoid mistakes, while the software developers are more open to probably do mistakes and be measured upon the number of bugs that they are receiving, which is much more transparent. With something like an open source, you would more easily see how, and with the broader society and the broader infrastructure of agreements, you're probably more likely going to see how good a contract really is, because it's going to be tested more often, probably even in court, and you would have much better reliability on, is this clause really giving me what I'm asking for? Because Linklaters and other law firms will give, top-notch law firms will give you this more or less watertight agreement, and but having a source that tells you just from experience in plenty other areas of the business that this clause is great, this term is great, is, I believe, even as valuable as a comment from a partner at Linklaters.
I think this idea of how do you replicate the rigor of software development testing against a legal document is a really interesting one, because in a good process, I think in a law firm, we do try and get close to that, because a more junior person drafts the document. When the senior person looks at it, really before they open the contract, they should be thinking, well, what are the client's objectives in this contract? What am I expecting this contract to receive, to achieve? And you basically, you have a checklist of things you want to test the contract for. Well, okay, if this scenario happens, does the contract lead to the right outcome, the outcome that the parties would expect? And I think we could do that in many cases in a more formal way, in a similar way. That in the software development industry, there are people who are professional testers. Well, that's how I understand it, but perhaps you can sort of comment on that a bit more. But it feels like actually, in terms of achieving quality, there's something that we can learn there from software development. And pair programming, you mentioned as well. That idea of what we would call a bit more sort of old-fashionedly a four eyes review, just getting somebody else to look at the contract and say, with fresh eyes, does this make sense? Looking over my shoulder, is really good practice that, again, I think we could do more of.
Yeah, great to hear about QAing, Will. I was going to say, sorry, Electra, go ahead.
Yeah, were you going to go, Electra?
All right, I'll go ahead. I was going to ask Tom, so at the moment, so you get one junior lawyer drafting it and one senior lawyer reviewing it. But if you had it in an open source community, you'd get hundreds of lawyers co-drafting it, and then thousands of lawyers reviewing it against a requirement. So your testing ability increases and the quality will increase, because it's not 4 eyes, it's potentially 4,000 eyes. So I think that's potentially a process, and yeah, Will.
Yeah, I think there are a few different things to touch on there. That crowdsourcing is fantastically valuable. So the infrastructure that we're building at Curve, obviously we don't want our engineers to be focused on building things that are non-differentiating. So standard things like passing messages between different services. There's some fantastic things out there already in the marketplace, both open source and commercial offerings built upon on top of that, where we can choose to get additional support and reassurance. You touched upon how, companies go to lawyers to get that reassurance. We can choose to host it and do it ourselves, or we can choose to pay a company who absolutely specialize in it, who then benefit from all the open source work and thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of users reporting on the bugs and coming back to improve things. I think failure is an interesting concept. Patrick, you touched on the notion of bugs, but one of the things we really like to monitor is the actual impact that we're having on our customers. So we borrowed a few things, and Google have been pioneers in this, actually, in the context of site reliability engineering. So all of our software, we don't host it ourselves. We don't have our own data centers. That would be absurdity in this day and age. We outsource that to both Amazon and to Google Cloud. And just thinking further on that, what was I going to expand on? Sorry, I'm not used to talking on these things so much. I think it's really beneficial, getting that feedback from other people. But to go on to testing, sorry, that's the area I wanted to go on to. We don't try and make everything perfect in the beginning. So that is where there's a slight differentiation, I think, between the legal sector and the technology sector. We try to get it as close as possible, but really a lot about what we're doing is around incremental delivery and incremental value. So we try to have very short feedback cycles. So if we do make a mistake, we can rectify it. Let's say we release some software that has got a bug that actually has an impact on customers. We've got automated procedures in place that mean that can automatically be rolled back and the period of impact will be minimalized. Then we'll go through, have a review and a retrospective and look at what went wrong. How do we prevent that in the future through either improved automation or improved testing processes and procedures in place?
And actually, this is really interesting because this is a bit like a lot of contracts aren't fit for purpose. They just sort of say things and people sign them and then they put them in a drawer and they never look at them again, and they're never really operationalized to find out whether these things happen. And if these things are happening, then you could just sign a change note and sort it out. But it's rarely, because that really happens because we don't operationalize them properly, because they're not written properly in the first place. Something I wanted to come on to, and both Tom and Will have touched on it, is modular programming and how you might construct a contract in a better way or not better way, Tom, depending on, well, just interdependency. So Will, it'd be good to hear from you about what modular programming is, how you use it, and perhaps Elektra, you can explain a bit about how that translates into the legal space.
Yeah, how best to describe modular programming? Effectively, we try and divide up applications and services by their type of functionality or their domain in which they operate. So you can compose an application. So if you open up Curve, the app on your phone, that can be talking through in the back end to hundreds of separate services, which independently can be changed. So we can make changes in isolation safely, knowing that one change in a particular place isn't going to negatively impact elsewhere. And we can actually additively add these features together to build something that I would say is greater than the sum of the parts, and choose how to compose things together effectively. And then in terms of, there's modularity and then there's configurability as well. So we may have modules which perform particular functions, but we can then choose to tune the parameters based upon the use case, which I imagine has got some parallels in terms of particular clauses within legal contracts and choosing how to change them.
Definitely. Elektra, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I'm very interested in modularity and the fact that when we draft contracts, we don't really take a modular approach because there are so many interdependencies between each module. So in my head, a module is a clause. And if we pick up an agreement, there are several clauses. You start reading a clause and it says, notwithstanding clause 7.1, blah, 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 and you're in clause 13. Why do I have to worry about clause 7.1 now when I'm reading clause 13? I know that cross-referencing is important, but we need to get better at it, because having to do that in terms of a user experience, having to worry about clause 7 when you're reading clause 13 is just cumbersome, and it creates inefficiency, and it also increases the room for error. So Tom, I know that you've got strong beliefs on cross-referencing, so do you want to
That makes me sound really sad.
I started thinking
I want to be the cool lawyer, and look what you've done. Yeah, I mean,
area.
I think at one level, I think we agree. Clearly, contracts need to be clear and drafted in plain English, and cross-references where you don't understand on the face of it why the cross-reference is there, and you spend all your time trying to turn the pages on a document. Even worse, I think, for us in the current era of working from home and when everything's on the screen, trying to flick backwards and forwards is a total nightmare. And it's just, it's a usability problem. So I'm not arguing that that we should have sort of obscure cross-references, but I think they do contribute to a modular design, because in our sort of document sets, one thing that we tend to do is have, and this is really boring lawyer stuff, so apologies for it, but we have a master definition schedule, and all of the other documents don't repeat all the definitions. You refer back to and incorporate the master definition schedule, and you call that up when you need to. And so in my head, that's quite similar to the modular approach in programming, because when you need a concept, you make a call effectively across to that other document and you pull it in. And I think that's quite efficient. And it does mean that, if I need to change one of the definitions, I can change the master definition schedule, and it immediately has a knock-on effect through all the documents. I don't need to amend 5 different documents. So I think that sort of cross-referencing is part of sort of a modular approach to drafting, but it has to be clear. And so, signposting, like, when you say it's, clause 17.1, putting in brackets the name of the clause, or explaining in respect of something rather, just to make it give a little bit of a flavor, so the person can decide, well, I do need to look at that, or okay, that's kind of what I expected, and I'm familiar with that clause, so let's not turn the page.
Yeah. Or if we could maybe hover on top of the hyperlink that says subject to clause blah blah blah, and it gave you a short description of what it said. And just back to the modularity bit, at the moment we use almost like back-end language when we draft contracts. There isn't a high-level description of what it says, so it makes it almost unusable to a person who's not legally trained to pick up a contract and understand it, even though the contract is usually for the business. So that's the first problem, that the lack of that high-level description, and the fact that we just clog up contracts with a load of programming language, when in fact what you should really be looking at is the front end. And if you really want to delve into what's going on, then as a lawyer you can go into the back end. So if we were able to use technology to kind of hover over something, and I know that Word kind of does that but isn't very good at it, and then it would reference back to the document. So yeah. Patrick, I know that you use some snazzy tools. You mentioned earlier that you use a software tool to manage bugs in contracts. Can you talk to that a bit more?
Sure. Yeah, we as I said, we learn a lot from software developers, and one of the things that we actually learned was that they use an amazing tool to track bugs and how they actually solve them in software development. So what we do in contracts is we thought, well, why can't we just track changes to the agreements? I mean, the prerequisite is that we mostly work on our paper. That why can't we track changes in the agreements in a system like Bugganizer, and also engage with other parties, internal stakeholders, to making sure that we all work from the same document, from the same standard, from the same position. So what we did is we carved out the sometimes lengthy discussion about this particular term in the agreement, translate it into something that the stakeholder who should be approving that particular change, translating it into something that's more readable for them, and then they, in that Bugganizer tool, raise a bug, and that person is going to be engaged in the Bugganizer tool then directly, and they can comment, they can ask questions. We bookmark the section in the agreement, so we have an internal version that we work on, and that's much more, let's say, engaging and focus on the real meta that we're trying to solve here. There's always the need for having somebody who's overseeing the whole contract, because sometimes if you do apply a change here, it affects another clause. Actually, what you're saying, Elektra, is that you want the clauses to be independent, which is version 4.0, right? This is where we want to head for, so that we actually have some not a puzzle, but a dynamic puzzle that can become bigger or smaller, depends on how you want it, right? So you can put together a couple of pieces, it makes a great picture, but you probably want to extend or expand because of the needs of a certain agreement. And this is really the next level that we want to get to. So the master schedule, the master definitions document that you just said, Tom, that's a great start, and it's so simple, but it's so effective. And the next step then is to have something where you make a change to the definition and don't have to worry at all that this definition change is going to have a not intended impact on other clauses that use the same definition. Because it's not always like you can use a definition and a defined term, but it's not always necessary for the same purpose, right? If you change the definition slightly, it might change the identification, but not necessarily the definition or the defined term you use in the LOL and the limitation of liability. So I guess the next level really is finding a module or modular contract that actually fits with almost every other contract, like finding good language for it. And one thing that we also try to do sometimes, or that we thought about, Elektra, is readability, something that you touched upon as well. It's sometimes the header for a certain section is already, we screw up there, right? We find something that's not readable, that's not understandable for everybody. And let's take a broader perspective here. We talk about lawyers, so we want to expand the conversation about agreements, not only to leave it to lawyers, we want to leave it to the whole teams on both sides, right? Because it's a commercial discussion. So in order to make it more readable and make the contract more acceptable also for them, we sometimes have to do just simple tricks. Not a real trick to trick somebody, but to make it more readable, we just find a solution. We just find a header that's more descriptive and more understandable using simple language. And I still remember a professor at law school who said, well, if you're able to explain a difficult legal issue in simple language, you actually got it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, someone sent me an article recently, actually, it was an Economist article that said you have a tendency to like add more things. It's much more difficult to obviously cut things down and make it much more concise. And something that everybody's touched on now is design thinking and implementing design thinking in law, which it's finally trickled down to the legal industry. But Tom, I know you've been involved with that at Links as well, so it'd be good to hear about what you think the benefits are, or what you've seen the benefits are at your firm.
Yeah, I think, and for us, actually for me personally, the main impact of it hasn't been specifically in contracts, but in generally how we provide our advice to clients and kind of rethinking the approach that we take to due diligence. And in that context, we used to provide 100, 200 page Word document table due diligence reports that we all knew nobody would read. But it gave some clients a lot of comfort that they had a weighty document in their waste paper bin that meant that somebody had given them some advice. But much more useful in that context, going back to something Elektra mentioned, is having an Excel document. And if you've done a contract review, putting that into the form of useful data that the client can then link up to their financial model. And so if we identify an issue, they can say, well, okay, I'll do a lookup across to the model to work out how much that particular contract is worth, and we can add them together. And the same approach, as you say, can be taken to the way in which we draft our contracts. So actually we're thinking, is this in the form that's most useful to the client? I think in the contracting space, one interesting sort of idea that I think we will move towards is a combination of contracts that are written in English and contracts that are written for computers to execute, because there are some aspects of our contracts where it's a payment waterfall. And there is no grey area. It's X gets paid first, Y gets paid second, and operationalizing that, to use Elektra's phrase, is putting it in a form in which a computer can read that and execute it on a monthly basis, for example.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Elektra?
That's smart contracts, I think, are definitely the future when it comes to that that binary, you pay, you don't pay, that sort of thing. The bit that computers won't be able to replace is the nuanced grey areas, where you use language that's deliberately vague because you want to have that openness, or you want to have that flexibility, or you want to be able to interpret stuff as and when they come along. That's not necessarily bad drafting, that's often deliberate. So that bit isn't fit for computers, but a lot of the stuff is. I remember when I worked at British American Tobacco, we had these huge agreements with 600 pages and 19 schedules, and most of the schedules were like that. They needed to be operationalized, and it was about how to do that on the ground, and that bit took longer than actually negotiating the agreement, much longer. It took about a year. So those bits we can definitely operationalize. It's the grey human areas that we can't.
And Will, in terms of, oh, sorry, Patrick, were you going to say something?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? That I still remember the times when the length of the contract was sort of the measurement of the quality of it.
Yeah.
Right. So that was kind of frightening, and still we tend to still try to use language that's probably not appropriate, but just for the sake of having it in there, right? We don't know why, but we just use it. We adapt. We speak our own language sometimes, which makes which scares sometimes software developers away because they don't understand. I always tend to tell them, okay, look, it's just mathematics with grammar, nothing else. So no major difference to what you do. Sometimes you do more advanced stuff even. But this is it, right? We try to sometimes copy and paste the verse for no sake, actually. And that's so stupid. That's something that I don't get. And so always asking the question, does this need to be in that contract? And if there is nobody saying yes, absolutely, and has compelling arguments, I just strike it through. Same with it with the one NDA project, right? It was amazing to see how many people were on the same page regarding, I don't know, just deleting a certain clause in the NDA that you probably have in your own NDA, but you're kind of not sure if you should be deleting it or not. But since you've heard from 10 other people on the call, you should be deleting it because it doesn't make any sense. You probably rethink and do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Will, how closely do you work with product when you're developing software? I mean, you kind of come at it from a different way to lawyers. Lawyers sort of get something in and they sort of retrofit it to the user, but you actually work from user stories and that way out.
Yeah, precisely. So I'm slightly biased because I'm covering product management at the moment as well. So very much focused on the users. But for me, software engineering and how it is going to be successful and how you build successful products, it fundamentally comes down to really understanding your customers, getting into their mindset. So in terms of how we approach engineering, before building software components out, we'll actually write out a series of user stories and acceptance criteria that clearly outlines what we're looking to achieve. That's something which, going back to what Tom said, can actually be tested against later to make sure we've satisfied those criteria. But not only that, one person may get it wrong. So before kicking off development, we'll have a session which we call the Three Amigos, where three particular people, software engineer, someone from the product side of things, and generally either a QA or somebody else, will go through and discuss and go through making sure that we've got a real understanding of what the requirements are. That's key. Otherwise, you end up delivering something which, oh, you asked for this particular feature and it satisfies it, but it's absolutely terrible to use. I think also just seeing, we've had some really good feedback from a couple of attendees here. I'd like to raise something Jay Smith has said. He wrote that what lawyers need is the equivalent of TypeScript and Visual Studio Code to draft and review documents. So TypeScript is a programming language created by Microsoft. It's a very popular one. And Visual Studio Code is what we call an integrated developer environment. And I can't imagine working without it. 20-something years ago when I started programming, it was with just the equivalent to Notepad effectively and very basic tooling. I was naive and self-taught. I can't imagine working without the level of tooling that we've got now. So as we're writing, there are autocomplete suggestions that come in and try to help us, that actually learn based upon what you've been doing as well. So AI is really advancing, and where before I would have had to have written 50 or 100 characters, I might start typing 2 and it automatically knows what I want to write, and I can just press another couple of things and it completes it. but it makes it much easier navigating through the system and through source code as well. So there's probably some fantastic things there. I know there was a suggestion for some tooling potentially. So there might be other legal technology experts who've got more specific understanding of what tooling is available. Another one mentioned about using Jira, and that is actually how we work on a daily basis. So we do track all the work that everyone is doing and have a daily discussion about what people have worked on, what they've completed, or what they're intending to work on, to make sure that we're not repeating the same thing, or we're helping one another, because we're all trying to come together and produce that product's outcome, the best outcome for the customer effectively.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Will. I was just gonna say, I'm gonna ask one last question, but also to leave a few minutes for questions at the end from everybody. So please stick your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to those. My last question was, what do you think is the one thing that we can start doing first? What's the one thing that we can learn from software developers that we think is the highest priority? Sorry, Elektra.
I think the Buganizer tool is amazing. What a great idea. We use Jira as well, but I really like the way that you kill the bugs rather than just raise them as tickets, and just use it as a task matter management tool, which is what we do at the Law Boutique. So yeah, I'm definitely going to look into putting that into place.
Patrick?
I think agility. So agility in contracts and negotiations. So just rethinking the way that we collaborate rather than being in silos, like counterparts, acting more agile together in operating in one document, rather than having everybody has their own document and produces the final version again. So why not having one final version where you just asynchronously add your feedback into the agreement, and then collaborate in the sessions that are really focusing on the additions that one party has been making to the agreement, and then either accept or change or whatever. So I think this is one of the priorities that I think is going to lift lots of the possibilities to actually accelerate contracts and negotiations.
Tom?
I think there's some overlap for me with what Patrick said. When you say it's a topic, this is such a big area. It's a topic we haven't really touched on at all. Is the sort of agile methodology that a lot of software development companies use. But I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there in terms of just the way that we work. In terms of developing contracts, does it need to be perfect when we send out the first draft, or can we get something out there that's a minimum viable product that people can then comment on, and we get things moving more quickly? Software developers often work in sprints. That idea of creating much more momentum around what we do. Similarly, the idea of sort of phasing the work and taking the time during a deal to reflect on what's gone well and what hasn't gone well. We tend to do that at the end of the deal, the kind of the recap. But actually, if you do that halfway through and you realize, everybody's been noticing the client hasn't been happy with something that we can do, then we can change it, and we can deliver a better outcome. It's all very well fixing things for the next deal, but ideally we're much more agile, I guess is the word for it, about how we adapt during an ongoing matter. Yeah,
that's a great one. And Will actually is missing a retro to be here, and you have them every 2 weeks. So yeah, definitely. Are there any questions from the audience? Can you talk a bit about the future of using blockchain and smart contracts? This might be one for you, Tom. Are there any low-hanging fruit that we can, or any major challenges that need to be addressed beforehand? The obligation is probably a big one.
Yeah, I think so. So there's this kind of idea of a Ricardian contract, the combination of English language and machine readable code. And I think if anything it's not low-hanging fruit, but I think that's the starting point to trying to think about this, is actually which bits of our contracts can we adapt to that approach, and which bits do we need the grayness and ambiguity of English language to help reflect the complexity of real life. To me, I think that's the starting point. I think with a lot of these initiatives, and actually where sort of one NDA is a great sort of precedent for us is bringing people together and just getting the energy behind something, because you can't really do any of this in isolation. It has to have the key players in the market coming together and agreeing that we're going to try something in a particular way. And even a few years ago, when we started talking about electronic signatures, we were saying it's crazy that you can go to your estate agent and they will get you to sign your new lease on electronic signature. But if we're doing a $1 billion deal, we're still sending signature pages over email. The real challenge at the time was just getting everybody to agree what works and what doesn't work, because everybody has slightly different processes. But one of the silver linings, I think, of people working from home is people being forced to adapt. And we've seen a huge uptick in the use of e-signing technologies, and clients have really valued it, because fundamentally the one thing that the senior people on the deal have to do is get their pen out at the end of the deal and put pen to paper. And if we can make that process easier, that's a great result.
Thanks, Tom. Another question: what's the biggest mistake the panel sees in trying to modernize legal functions? Patrick?
The biggest what? Sorry.
The biggest mistake that you see in trying to modernize legal functions.
The biggest mistake is that we focus on the technology and forget about the first step, which starts with our mindsets. We're trying to address a problem, or we're trying to solve a problem by adding technology and not changing our mindset. And that's the biggest mistake, I guess. We're just creating a landscape of tools that probably help us on the go, but they're not addressing the real need and the real challenge that we see.
Yes. Elektra, do you want a last word on that?
No, it's perfect.
Can I add one
yes, please, Will, go for it.
Perspective? I absolutely abhor the phrase digital transformation, because it's so ambiguous. It should be focusing on what do you actually want to change? What are you improving? So I fully agree with Patrick there.
Excellent. Well, on that note, we'll call it an end here. Thank you so much, everybody. That was fantastic. If you have any other questions, just send them over via email and we'll get them answered for you. But thank you all for joining the panel.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the possibility.